Okay, so we've got a functioning checklist. The only thing now is we want the data to persist from uh, one use of the application to the next, and this is where we need to start saving, and we start using JSON. So I'm going to create a new function, and it's going to be save JSON data, and we're going to be using the file path for this. We also need another directive, system.io. That's how we read and write from files. So we're going to first check if file.exists using our file name. Let's see. What do I call it? File path. So if our file path already exists, it means there's some data already there. And if we're going to be saving, we want to write whatever's on top of that data. Or, I guess in this case with our checklist, we actually just want to overwrite all the data there. Instead use the new updated data. So if it exists, we're going to do file.write all text file path, and now we need to decide what it is we're writing. So for now, I'm just going to say contents. So in a second, we're going to determine what these contents will be, but for now, we're basically going to overwrite the file, if it exists, with these contents. Because we're doing a checklist, we don't really care about what data was there before, because every time we load the application, we're going to reload that data. And so whenever we save, we can just overwrite anything that's already in that file. So I don't even think we need this file exists, because in our case, even if the file doesn't exist, we're still going to write. And write all text will also create a file at the file path if it doesn't exist. So this works. Let's determine what our content should be now. So we have this list of objects. This where is it? It's called checklist objects, and each object is a checklist object too. We want to turn those objects into JSON. So a quick example of how you would do that: list object temp equals new checklist object. So this is just an example. So I could say JSON utility dot to JSON, and I just give it the object, and this will turn that object into a JSON object based on the member variables. So it'll create a JSON object with object name, type, index, kind of what we saw right here in this checklist. It'll create this JSON object using name, type, index. So that's how you do that. So I'll go back to Checklist Manager tutorial, and I'm going to delete this because we don't want to do it on some temp object. We want to do it on the objects in our checklist. So I'm going to loop through our, let's see, what is it? Our checklist objects. Checklist objects.count, and I'm going to start adding information to contents. So contents plus equals checklists or JSON utility dot to JSON checklist objects I. So this will start adding each object as a turn into JSON, and it'll add it to our contents. There's one last thing for later to make it easier to parse this data. I want to add a new line after each JSON object so that later I can split by new line, and that'll help me just grab one object one at a time. So this is all I need for JSON to store, and now I should be storing that information when I'm saving. And you can decide when you want to call this save function. You can either call it every time you create a new object, or if you're not too worried about losing data, you can call this whenever the user quits the application. It's up to you. I think in this case, because calling this every time the user adds an object isn't very inefficient, I think I'm just going to do it in that case. So basically, whenever a checklist item is created, I'm going to create, or I'm going to save. So I'll just call save JSON data, and this will just create a text file with the JSON information. So let's try it out. I'll do apple, which is a fruit, and I will do banana, which is also a fruit, and I'll do steak, which is a meat. Okay, so every time I did that, it should have gotten saved. So let's go ahead and check our users, your user, app data, local low, the company, Cali2, checklist, checklist. There it is, apple, banana, steak. It looks like the index is a little screwed up, so let's figure out why that happened. If I go to where this index is called index equals 0, check. So the first object that we created should have had an index of 0. The second object, it's going to get set back to 0 because of this -1. So it actually should have been, oh, actually we don't need this -1 because we are adding this item object to checklist objects after we set up this info. So we actually didn't need that, and then we actually don't need this anymore either, because when there are 0 objects in checklist objects that count, index will be equal to 0. This should be an int. There we go. Let's try that one more time. Give it a sec to load. I'm going to add apple again, fruit, orange, fruit, and let's look now at our checklist. Apple 0, orange, index 1. Great. Okay. So now we want to be able to load that information. So we're saving it now. Now let's load it. So let's call load JSON data. So once again, we don't need this string, but we will need to check, in this case, if the file exists. If the file doesn't exist, obviously there's nothing for us to load, and we should probably just return. There's no point. So if file.exists file path, in fact we could even .log no file, just for our benefit. If the file does exist, we want to grab the JSON objects. So remember I added the new line so it'd be easier to parse later. Well, now is when now is later, so I'm going to create a string which holds all the contents, and this is going to be equal to file.readAll text file path. I'm going to want to split the contents by the new line separator, and this should give me each individual JSON object. And then now what I want to do is I want to start creating a checklist item with this. So I will call create checklist item. The name, well, first I need to turn my object back into a checklist object toot. So I do that by saying checklist object toot temp. It's basically going to be a temporary object equals JSON utility dot from JSON. And then now inside these brackets I need to give the type that I'm trying to turn a JSON back from. So, and then I just give it the JSON information, which is going to be split contents, whatever index. So at this point I'm realizing I need a loop. So for each string content in split contents, I'm going to want to add the stuff back. And I'm going to need to give this the index, oops, or just content. Great. So this line is going to turn one JSON object back into a checklist object. And then now using that checklist object, I can say temp.name, temp.type, which would be type. And then in this case, I really want to be able to get the index too. So to fix this, I'm going to add the index again. But I only want to add the index, or I only want this index part to happen when I'm loading rather than adding. So I'm just going to have a bool to check if I'm loading. So when loading is true, I want to use this index. In fact, I'm just going to call it something else, load index. Actually, I can even make it not mandatory by making it have a default value. So this means it has a default value. I'm also going to have loading have a default value of false. And this way I can still call create checklist with only 2 parameters, or I can call create checklist with 4 parameters. So anyways, I only want to set this index value to checklist objects.count if loading is false. So I'm actually just going to do index equals load index, and then we'll do if loading index equals checklist objects.count. Otherwise, it's just going to be equal to load index. And then everything else should be the same. So this allows me to also here set the load index equal to content.index. Let's see. Does this not have an index? No, it does. Why is it not? Oh, sorry. It's called temp, not content. Temp.index. And then I want to set this to true, meaning we are loading. And then my other scenario where I'm creating checklist, which is on add, which is right here. We don't need to change anything because of those 2 default values. Okay. So this should now read from the file and basically create those items for us. The last thing we want to do is we don't want to call save while we're in the process of loading. because then it will just overwrite everything. So we only want this to happen if not loading. Same thing with switch mode. That's not necessary when we're loading because the mode should already be the checklist mode. So, okay, we're going to want to make sure that we call our load JSON data function, and we're just going to call that in start because we want it to happen every time we load the application. Make sure to do it after this file path is named, otherwise it won't know where to load from. And then there's a couple other problems we're going to run into. For now, I'll just test it so you can see what happens. So I'm getting this cannot deserialize JSON error, and that's because of the way we're trying to, or what type of object we're trying to serialize. So this checklist object class, because it has this private text objects can't be serialized, only strings, ints, and floats can be serialized. So that makes this class a problem to try to serialize. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to create kind of a temporary or a separate class inside Checklist Manager tutorial. I'm just going to call this checklist item, and I'm just going to basically give this class everything that the checklist object has without the text field. So public string object name, public string type, and public int index. And then I'm also going to create an initializer for this class. So public checklist item, and then I'm going to give this initializer function a name, a type, and index, and I will just set this to object name equals name, this dot type equals type, this dot index equals index. Now, if you've never created a class like this before, this also shouldn't be, string should be there. If you've never created a class like this before, basically this is just a class with some member fields, and when I call new on the object type of the class, that's when it's going to use this function. So if I say new checklist item, it's going to expect a name, a type, and an index. Okay, so now everywhere I have this checklist object, like here, I need to switch this to checklist item, or I just call it checklist item, and then I need to do the same here. It needs to be a checklist item. Let's see where else. When I'm saving, I need to save it as a checklist item, not so. Instead of this will return a checklist object. So what I want to do is create a temporary checklist item, and this will be using that initializer function, and then I'm just going to give it checklist objects I dot object name, make sure it's object name, checklist objects I dot type, and checklist objects I dot index. And then I'm going to replace this with temp. Okay, so now we should be using checklist items instead of these checklist objects, and because there is only string and int fields, they should be serializable, which just means they can be turned into JSON objects for us to load and write to the file with. Okay, so let's try again and see if there's anything else we need to fix. Okay, great. So now you can see it loaded a fruit object. Let me try another one. And then let's stop it and hit play again. Okay, great. You can see all the fruit objects it loaded. I'm just going to get rid of that debug that I put in. If you want to know how to debug or see what it looks like, where is it? Right here. You can put this debug in if you want. I just did it just to see what was happening. And then also this no file should actually be in an else. There we go. Okay, so I guess the last thing to test now is what happens if we remove an item. Does it get removed from the text file? It should. And it does not. Let's figure out why it doesn't get removed from the text file. We need to make sure that we're saving every time we remove, which we didn't do. So inside check item, after we remove something from the checklist, we need to call save JSON data. And now if we go back and try it again, and I'll remove 2 of these items, and they're gone. Great. Just so we can see this also from the text file, we're going to go back into app data, local low, should be CalIT2 JSON checklist, and there's our last item with an index of 2. If you wanted, you could also start changing the index of everything. Because the objects are ordered by index and it's a list, it doesn't actually matter if it's not 0 based. The only thing that would make it matter is if we're creating a new object, it would probably put it in the 0 slot. Let's actually test that. Let's create a new object, orange. Oops, I created 2 oranges. That wasn't a good choice. Let's do apple and banana and peach. I don't know. Apparently I just like using fruits. Let's check the checklist again, and I'm going to need to refresh it. So I'm just going to close it and open it again. So all have index 0. Let's figure out why that happened. They should not all have the same index. Oh, this should say if not loading, I think, is the problem. Okay, so that should have fixed it, but we need to make sure that we delete the old checklist, because those 0 indexes will still show up because that's how they were saved. Let's restart it now. Let's try adding some new fruits again. Okay, and then if I stop it, let me close this again and open it again. And there you go, there's the indexes. And they are now correct. So that's pretty much everything you need to know for now about JSON. If you, or I plan to make another video to teach how to categorize each of these objects by type, but that's not really necessary for this JSON part at least. So that should be it. Thank you for watching, and let me know if there's anything else that you guys would like as videos.